Hello everyone, and welcome to the September edition of the Farmers Supply Association Agri Report. I'm Randy Klepechka, agronomist with Farmers Supply Association. Well, as you can see in the background, harvest season is here upon us. It's been a very slow beginning to the harvest season. You know, looking at the weather from this past year, you know, we had the heat wave, the drought from late May really until about the middle to late July. Then July 28th through 29th, we had a cold front go through, and you know, things got a lot cooler. During August, we had a lot of cloudy, showery, some rainy days and stuff like that, and that really, we were on the fast track until that time happened. But after that, things really slowed down as far as maturity of our crop, and things have just been at a snail's pace since then, and it's really been slow to get this harvest going. We're taping on September the 14th. Some guys are going pretty good, and we've got some guys that have, you know, rice, corn, and soybeans and haven't cut the first acre yet. So it's really slow to get going, and a lot of our guys are getting antsy because we've got some pretty good harvest weather upon us, and we really want to take advantage of that. We do have a warm stretch of weather predicted ahead. Next week, again, we're taping on the 14th, and next week looks sunny, warm temperatures in the 90s every day, and that's just what the doctor ordered to get some maturity of this crop that is not matured yet. So hopefully we'll get a pretty good stretch of hot weather, and then we can go from there. As far as yield so far, kind of a mixed bag. Corn has really been kind of a disappointment in a lot of areas. It's really not, I wouldn't hate to call it a disappointment, because we knew that a lot of our corn wouldn't be very good this year. We just had too much heat, too much dry weather, and that has really affected our corn yields in a lot of places. You know, nothing we can do about the heat. We can do all we can about the irrigation, but sometimes it's just so hot and so dry that it's hard to keep up with irrigation no matter what. So we've got some poor yields because of that, just because we couldn't keep up with irrigation along with the hot weather. So, you know, I would classify our corn crop as average to much below average, although I did hear a yield yesterday of about 237 up north of here. So, you know, that's a really good yield. So it is a mixed bag, but overall I would say it's a, you know, kind of a weak corn crop, and we knew that was going to happen. Looking at rice yields are, I would classify rice yields probably as average this year. You know, a lot of yields that have been probably not as good as we've had in, you know, in our good years, not as good as last year, but still it's not a bad rice crop, and that's what I was kind of anticipating. You know, a good crop but not a great crop. We're still got a lot of guys not cutting yet, so, you know, I think we're still a lot to learn about our yields and quality of this year's rice crop. But so far the indications are that it's going to be average at best, and just not kind of a little less than some of our better crops have been. Again, on the milling yields, very preliminary reports from Jared Hartke down at Stuttgart says that milling is going to be pretty average this year. Certainly better than last year, which was a bad milling year. But anyway, I guess you can classify it as probably an average yield and an average milling yield is kind of what we're looking at so far. When it is one of those years where it's slow to get going as far as harvest, you know, one of the things that we get questions about is harvest aids. You know, like sodium chlorate for rice, gramoxone for soybeans. You know, guys are wanting to speed things up a little bit, so we start getting more questions about harvest aids, and I've been getting questions about those items the last couple of weeks. I've recommended some harvest aids for both rice and soybeans, so you know, sometimes they'll help and sometimes they won't. Harvest aids can be very beneficial. They can speed things up. They can make harvest easier. You know, they can get rid of some weeds that might be out in the field, help desiccate them, and just make overall harvest better. But they can be very harmful if you don't use them right. So again, like I said, I've recommended harvest aids in both rice and beans already this year, but you got to use them right, or you'll pay a price for them. So I just want to talk about some of the do's and don'ts with harvest aids in both rice and soybeans. With rice, what can happen is we can over dry our crop that's out in the field, and this can affect milling yields. It can cause shattering of the grain off of the rice panicle, rice head, and you'll have loss that way, and then you'll have the milling yield issues because you get over dried, and then you get heavy dews, you get rain showers, and that alternate wetting and drying can cause that milling yields to go down. With soybeans, if you go too early, you can pay a big, and I mean big, yield penalty. So we got to be careful with both of these crops and use these materials wisely. Looking at rice, first, grain moisture is the big thing. We've got to get it in that right range. We don't want to start salting our regular varieties until they're definitely below 25%. With the hybrids and that long panicle and the varying degrees of moisture sometimes on those long panicles, we don't want to start till 23. So don't start above 23 on a hybrid, above 25 on a variety. And then by the time that moisture gets down to about 18 or so, it's about time to quit using a harvest aid. And if we do use a harvest aid at those late times, let's lower that rate a little bit. If you're going a gallon, earlier, maybe back that off to about 3 quarts or so on those late applications of harvest aids on rice when that moisture is getting down there near that bottom range where we recommend salt. Where there's uneven maturity in the field, probably best to stay away from a harvest aid. You may have some too dry, some not dry enough, so let's avoid harvest aids in those situations. And don't expect major moisture drops. In the tests where they've done, university's done some tests, and where they've used harvest aids and not used harvest aids, they can go out and harvest 3 days later, 7 days later, whatever the range is, and still not have about a 2% moisture difference, even where they've used the harvest aid. So let's be careful. Let's use these harvest aids properly. Again, they can be a huge tool for you in rice, but let's be careful and let's obey all those do's and don'ts, because you can pay a penalty if you don't. Moving to soybeans, since we've got into the early soybean maturity system, the early planting, early maturity, more and more people are using harvest aids to try to get their crop out in a timely manner, get it out a little earlier before some bad things happen. When applying a harvest aid in soybeans, it's all about the growth stage of that soybean crop. We want to do it no earlier than growth stage 6.5. Growth stage 6.5, you'll see yellowing, obvious yellowing in the field. You can go out and peel those pods open and look at that seed within that pod, and it's going to be separated from that pod wall. There's no white membrane there anymore. The bean is just kind of loose within that pod if you open it up, and that's the point, that's the earliest point we would recommend a harvest aid on soybeans. So keep that in mind. Yellowing, separation from the pod wall, that's the time you can start thinking about harvest aids. Don't do it earlier than that unless you have some kind of special reason to do it, because you're going to suffer significant yield loss. Those beans just haven't fully developed yet, and the yield loss can be substantial. We had a Farmer Supply customer, I think that was last year, who's been messing with harvest aids for a little while, and he wanted to do his own test and see what the yield loss can be for going early. And I was just kind of stunned when he told me the results of it. On those fields where he applied a harvest aid in this test a little bit early when they were still green, before that growth stage 5, he had a 22 bushel yield loss in those in that area where he applied that harvest aid too early. So the yield loss can be major, significant. The university also has done some tests with very similar results, where they apply harvest aid before right around growth stage 6. Before that 6-5 yellowing phase occurs, they've had yield losses above 50% in those ranges. So it's really similar type yield losses. So again, don't apply soybean harvest aids before growth stage 6-5. The beans are obviously yellowing, and you obviously got separation of that soybean from that pod wall within that pod. As far as materials, gramoxone is by far the most used of the harvest aid materials for soybeans. Sodium chlorate can have a place, Sharpen can have a place, AIM can have a place. So keep those in mind. But most people are going to look at the gramoxone for harvest aids in soybeans. So again, with rice and beans both, follow these rules I've just mentioned, and you'll probably like the results. It's going to make harvest easier, maybe speed it up just a little bit, but avoid those do not things I talked about, because if you do those, you're going to have bad quality losses in rice, maybe some quality losses in beans as well, and you're going to have major yield losses in soybeans if you go too early. So that kind of wraps it up on the harvest aids. Before I leave, I want to talk a little bit about wheat, because it's September 14th, and I got my first call this morning about planting wheat planting dates, and it's just too early. Don't jump the gun on planting wheat. I like to see, the university says the month of October, basically, for planting wheat. I really like to wait even a little bit later, maybe around the 10th of October, and try to get it planted between the 10th of October and early November. But don't go out there and planting wheat for grain now. Now, if you're planting it for forage or for cattle or something like that, that's fine. But for if you're growing it for grain, don't plant wheat this early. There's a lot of bad things can happen. You can get way too much growth in the fall, and that's going to set you up for freeze damage. There's some insects, there's some diseases that both occur when you plant it too early. So again, let's wait till October to plant this wheat, and don't be thinking about it right now, because you may regret it in the end. So again, harvest is moving along. Hopefully we're going to get that window of sunny, hot weather that they're talking about, and I think that'll speed this harvest up, and hopefully we can finish up a good harvest season. This has been Randy Kulpechka with your Farmer Supply Association Agri Report.